Hello, a good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Aaron Bastani, and tonight I'm joined by Kieran, Andrieu. Kieran, how are we?
Battling through dreadful weather and depressing news as ever, Aaron, but it helps that this is our first show together of the new year. How are you?
You seem to have such a sunny complexion with the fabulous lighting we have in the studio. I wish it was summer. I'm actually deeply sick. I was bedridden for a few days. I'm back. I'm very happy to be hosting today's show, though. I probably shouldn't be hosting it. I suspect I'm not infectious, what with it being week 2.
Damage is done, probably.
Before anybody wants to have a go at me. But these are really, really important news stories we're talking about tonight. And I'm very grateful to be able to cover them with yourself and, of course, be joined by our fantastic audience. Coming up on tonight's show, concerns are growing for the health of the Palestine Action hunger strikers, with one activist having been on strike for over 70 days. First, though, we'll, of course, be discussing the latest developments from Iran. As ever, if you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you can go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. My goodness, with all the slop out there right now, we really need it. And of course, make sure to let us know what you think tonight using the comments in the YouTube chat. This show is for and about you. I try to read as many of them as possible. There is very little verifiable information coming out of Iran at the moment. But according to the government, the mass anti-regime protests that have rocked the country since late December are beginning to subside. That may be true. It may not be true. But the world's most powerful person doesn't appear to want to see that happening. US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social today. Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions. Save the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a big price. I have cancelled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on its way. MIGA. Make Iran great again. President Donald J. Trump. And now it's pretty hard to read the tea leaves on this one. Trump has repeatedly threatened Iran with a military strike, posting this last week. If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump. But we know that protesters have been killed, and we played footage of many bodies in a Tehran morgue on yesterday's show. At that stage, estimates of the number of dead range from between 3 and just over 500 people. But today, we've had a different figure from a person within the government. An Iranian official has spoken to Reuters off the record. He told the news agency that around 2,000 people have so far been killed in the unrest, including both protesters and security personnel. The source didn't give a breakdown of the figures for those two groups, but Iranian leaders do appear to be taking a dual approach to the protests, offering concessions on what they call, quote, legitimate grievances, while enforcing a harsh security regime, which has included the use of live gunfire against protesters. That crackdown has led Iranian officials to say the protests are beginning to die down, which, for all we know, may be true. If it is true, then Trump's most recent post could be seen as encouraging more people to take to the streets of Iran's major cities, further risking their lives. It would also likely feed into the Iranian government's domestic narrative that protesters are being manipulated by outside forces, specifically the US and Israel. But putting additional pressure on Iran's population would be of a piece with other moves from within the Trump administration. This was a post from Trump last night. Effective immediately. Any country doing business with the Islamic Republic of Iran will pay a tariff of 25% on any and all business being done with the United States of America. This order is final and conclusive. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And now that is effectively a sanction on any trade with Iran. So not just oil, but food, supplies, medicines, anything. Since the current protests in Iran were at least triggered by merchants objecting to the collapse of the country's currency, and the generally dire economic circumstances following fresh oil sanctions last year, these new restrictions on Iranian imports may well have a very fast and very catastrophic impact on the economy. But will also have economic impacts on Iran's trading partners, one of which is China. And the country hit back almost immediately, threatening its own retaliatory tariffs in response to Trump's, with a spokesperson saying that China would, quote, take all necessary measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. The EU was quick to follow Trump's lead, as it always is, with European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen posting this. The rising number of casualties in Iran is horrifying. I unequivocally condemn the excessive use of force and continued restriction of freedom. The European Union has already listed the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety under its human rights sanctions regime. In close cooperation with HRVP Kaya Kallas, further sanctions on those responsible for the repression will be swiftly proposed. We stand with the people of Iran who are bravely marching for their liberty. In our own parliament, the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has also been talking about the Iranian protests.
It takes huge bravery to protest and to speak out in the face of this oppression, especially for women who continue to face and endure severe repression in their daily lives. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom condemns in the strongest of terms the horrendous and brutal killing of Iranian protesters, and we demand that the Iranian authorities respect the fundamental rights and freedoms of their citizens. On Friday, the Prime Minister joined with the German Chancellor and the French President in condemnation of this violence and to call for an end to the violence. It is a message that I have also delivered directly to the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi yesterday, setting out the UK's total abhorrence at the killings, the violence and the repression that we are seeing, urging them to immediately end the violence and change course. And today, as the further reports have come through, the Minister for the Middle East, at my instruction, has summoned the Iranian ambassador to underline the gravity of this moment and to call Iran to answer for the horrific reports that we are hearing.
I'm pretty sure the Iranian ambassador understands the gravity of what's happening. It seems that thousands of people have been killed, possibly hundreds, at least dozens of security personnel, which is just very unusual. Yeah, I'm not trying to take sides. Of course I wouldn't take sides. What is happening is appalling. But generally speaking, when a state sees dozens of internal security personnel being killed, it would indicate the beginnings of a civil war. That's kind of incontrovertible as far as I'm aware of things. It kind of reminds me of the early stages of Syria. So I don't think the Iranians need to be reminded of that. They're fighting for their lives. I'm sure many of you watching and listening to this would be saying, good. But they are fighting for their lives. This is, without doubt, the most intense sequence of protests, I think, since at least 2009, I think, frankly, since the revolution and since the Iran-Iraq war. It's the biggest challenge to the government of Iran since the Iran-Iraq war, which, of course, finished in 1988. There's a few things I want to talk about before coming to you, Kieran, and before coming to Séamus, Malekafzali, who we've got down the line in a minute. On the sanctions, I mean, people don't really know this, but the sanctions on Iran by the United States are some of the most stringent sanctions in the world. I say some of the most because, of course, it's now in a club of two with the Russian Federation. But until those sanctions were imposed on Russia following its incursion into Ukraine, they were the harshest sanctions in human history. Iran's central bank was the world's first ever central bank to be sanctioned. It can't access dollars. Very hard to run a country and import and export goods without access to significant amounts of dollars. Those sanctions have been progressively implemented since 2006-2007, but like I say, the central bank is in 2012. About 9/10 of Iran's foreign exchange reserves, which were held overseas, they can't access. So this idea that we'll sanction the IRGC or we'll close some embassies when you've literally sanctioned the country's central bank, which, by the way, has really worked. The country's economy is being shredded to bits. It doesn't seem serious to me, Kieran. It doesn't seem serious as a political response. And I think it's in keeping with a lack of honesty from our political class about what's going on and what needs to happen. You've got two options as I see it. You either try and get some defections from the elite within the Islamic Republic, whatever your long-term goals are, incremental change within the regime or a Deng Xiaoping style figure or something completely different, or an autocrat like Sisi in Egypt. You would need some carrot. Or you go full regime change, no-fly zones, you arm and you resource organizations within the country to effectively take up an armed struggle, right? Iran is a country of 90 million people. The IRGC has, I think, over 120,000 people. You aren't gonna beat that, I think. I could be wrong. I've been wrong many times before in my life. But you're not going to beat that with this strategy. What you're going to do is create gradually a failing state. Gradually, you're going to erode its capacity to operate as a functioning state, maintain any kind of stability, including price stability, which is why these protests started in the first place. And I feel there's a lack of honesty from our political class about that. You've got these two options, and instead they're talking about sanctioning embassies, closing embassies, or sanctioning the IRGC. You've got Omar Jalili, literally a comedian, and J.K. Rowling, literally a children's author, who are the people offering the key insights about what the optimal strategy for dealing with Iran is. I take all of this as incredibly unserious, and I have to say, this story stands out, I think, as the single greatest example yet of our media running on vapors. There is zero information being relayed to the wider public about context, about where we go next, about potential consequences. And I think it's kind of unprecedented in that regard.
Yeah, and probably I'm going to briefly begin with George Orwell, who said of Salvador Dali that one has to be able to hold in their head simultaneously two things. One, that Salvador Dali is a great artist, and two, that he's a terrible human being. And I think this is ultimate simultaneous thoughts held in the head at once. Time. Because on the one hand, we are seeing genuine, in some quarters, we can't quantify it, genuine uprising against the regime in Iran, and we're seeing genuine oppression against that uprising. And if that government source is to be believed that 2,000 people have been killed, then obviously it's utterly disgusting. But at the same time, I completely agree that the political and media class is true to form, entirely unserious about the consequences that might flow from this, and also completely unserious about the design, the strategic dimensions of this from the perspective of Tel Aviv and Washington. And Israel is playing a significant role in what's going on. That doesn't mean I think that they're funding and arming people on the streets. That's not what I'm saying. But there are clearly interests that flow from Israel around a failed state in Iran. And I think that is the design. I think that's on purpose. And I don't think that they're particularly interested in regime change per se. I think they're much more interested in regime collapse and then institutional chaos. Israel is master of tolerating chaos and making of chaos strategic advantage. And I think that as far as they're concerned, Iran is the head of the octopus. Mm. And if they can lop off the head of the octopus, or if the head of the octopus can be removed, then it will be much, much easier to consolidate Israeli statecraft in the region. And so that's what I want to say preliminarily. Again, this is a very difficult situation. I've been tussling with it. I know you've been tussling with it, Aaron. But that's ultimately where we stand right now.
And I think in terms of Iran and the region, again, people might not be apprised of all the facts here. It goes back a long way. You, of course, have the revolution in 79. I think in 81, 82, you start to get suicide bombings in Lebanon, which are some of the first major suicide bombings you see in the region. Of course, suicide bombings as well were used in the Iran-Iraq war. Iran had so few weapons at their disposal. You had literally young kids just blowing themselves up to stop Iraqi advances with regards to tank columns and so on. When they say martyrdom was central to that war, they really mean it. But the suicide bombings in Lebanon, led by the Islamic Republic, meant that the French left Lebanon. The United States left Lebanon. They were highly effective. And of course, then feeds into attacks on Israel in Lebanon. And I don't support people blowing themselves up, by the way. The point is, it was a new kind of military tactic. You see that alongside the kidnapping of diplomatic staff in Iran, American diplomatic staff in Iran. Again, I don't agree with that. But this was a regime a state which just didn't play by the kinds of rules that you would see generally in the region with Baathists or Pan-Arabism, Nasserism, like socialists. It was a very different kind of way of conducting geopolitics and trying to extend power. And that's fed through all the way through to 2026. I talked about this with Vali Nasr. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. It has something called forward defense. And it viewed, rightly or wrongly, I suspect if you're Syrian or Lebanese, wrongly, it viewed the front line of Iran's territorial defense as being in these places because if you can fund Hezbollah, if you can prop up Assad, it means that you're keeping Israel and the United States away from the door. And that logic, again, whatever you think of it, was founded in response to the war on terror, post-2003, George W. Bush saying that we will remove a series of dictators in Iraq, in Syria, and Iran. That was the military and geopolitical response. Now, I think it's been a disaster in 2026. But Tehran for 20 years could say, well, it's worked because nobody's attacked us. And in the context of Iranian politics, to not have an attack on mainland Iran between 1988 and 2025 is kind of unprecedented. Again, for people who aren't aware of this, Iran throughout the 20th century was being occupied, seeing its leaders removed. You know, it was occupied by the Russians and the Brits in the 1910s, 1920s. You have the Shah removed. The crown is forced onto his son by external force in 1941. You have Mossadegh in the 50s. So the idea that Tehran would actually administer the country and it would be a sovereign country in charge of its own borders is quite a new thing. And I think it's led to all kinds of bizarre and ultimately self-destructive military and geopolitical moves. But I'm just trying to explain where that idea of forward defense comes from. And of course, if you're an Iranian right now, if you're somebody who's in the regime, you'll be saying, see, we lost Syria, we lost in Lebanon, and look what subsequently happened. That's what they would say. That's what they would say. Now, Cooper wasn't alone in summoning the Iranian ambassador. In what appears to be a coordinated effort, the leaders of France, Germany, Finland, and Denmark made similar announcements this afternoon. Cooper has also announced a wide-ranging package of new sanctions against the Islamic Republic. Last night, in an interview with Al Jazeera, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was asked about the prospect of a US-led military intervention.
We are ready for any action. If they want to test military action, which they tested once and achieved no result, we are ready for that. We now enjoy a higher level of readiness, both qualitatively and quantitatively, compared to before the 12-day war. We are prepared for all options. If they want to test any option, including the diplomatic option, it must be under the conditions I mentioned. What matters is the extent to which a wise approach is adopted. Unfortunately, there are those who seek to drag the United States into war and endless wars in order to achieve Israel's interest. We must see to what extent the United States chooses to move along the path of wisdom.
There's a comment I've just seen here. Maybe we can pull this up. And I think it's one of the most worrying tendencies I see online. If we can get it up, it'd be great. If we can't, it's about Iran's exceptionalism. Here we go. Matthew SC7X, you guys are so uninformed. Iran is a different country compared to others in the Middle East. They're not going to be a failed state no matter what happens. Europe had failed states in the 17th century, or Europe basically had a century of civil war in the 17th century. It's why Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan. He saw what civil war looked like in England. You had the 30 Years' War on the continent. Iran has been a failed state before. The whole reason why Reza Pahlavi's father, Reza Shah, comes to power in the 20s is because basically the country is fragmenting and chaotic and fundamentally in a state of what we would probably think of as civil war. So this idea that Iran is exceptional, I find very lazy. It's not exceptional. Nowhere's exceptional. Any country can become a failed state. Any country. I saw Syrians say the same thing in 2011. Guess what happened next? I saw Libyans say the same thing. Within a few years, you see open-air slave markets in the streets of Tripoli. We're now joined down the line by Séamus Malekafzali. Séamus, great to be joined by you. What are your thoughts about some of the issues we've covered so far, and also this, I think, frankly, lazy riposte to the impossibility of Iran becoming a failed state or a balkanized state?
I mean, that argument that you're talking about, that Iran can never become a failed state, that was something that was trotted out by reporters at the Saudi-backed Iran International channel, that Iran had learned the lessons from Libya and Syria, or was functionally smarter than these populations, and that it could never fall into these same sorts of disarray. I think from these protests, you can really see the effects that disorganization has had on the Iranian opposition, the thorough destruction of opposition by not only the Iranian government, but by other governments trying to take advantage of it. In a lot of other states that have gone through civil war or have gone through uprisings, there are political parties, there are militant factions with very strong institutions that can survive under a great deal of pressure. Whereas here, a lot of protesters which are utilizing pro-Shah slogans, which are chanting in favor of the return of the royal family, they are being instigated by Reza Pahlavi, speaking from Maryland, through Telegram or Instagram, and then these calls get disseminated through Instagram as well. But there are no organizations on the ground. There are no political parties on the ground. There's nothing on the ground that can bring that into a larger stage of coherence. So you have Reza Pahlavi calling over the weekend for protesters to take control of city centers, to essentially move to hold and build institutions in the way that other groups would be able to. And not just because of this violent crackdown, but there are functionally no institutions. There is no state in waiting to take over. So they go into the streets, they clash with police, hundreds of people are killed, and then nothing functionally happens. And then Reza Pahlavi still gets to go on CBS with Norah O'Donnell and say that this is a war, there are casualties in war. And then the cycle can go on as usual, with Pahlavi calling for people to start burning down communication centers or to go to embassies and take down flags, and nothing fundamentally changes. The fact that there is no coherent, cogent opposition to the Islamic Republic has been a massive boon to the regime, but it also means that the government, if it is pushed into a state of collapse by military intervention, by economic strangulation, then that means that potentially nothing can take its place, that there is a functional state collapse in which separatists, which are much more organized, can take more precedence, and there can be even more bloody crackdowns in the future, because there is nothing governing the structure of any of these clashes, the momentum of any of these clashes.
Séamus, why do you think the Iranian opposition is so weak? And before, again, people think I'm trying to be sort of pro-regime. I'm not pro-regime. I can't go to Iran because of the nature of the political composition of the country. My family, and I'm sure members of your family as well, are suffering from these sanctions and whatnot. I'm in no way in favor of the political status quo in Iran. I think something has to happen, right? You can make an argument as to how that happens and what's the end point, but something clearly has to happen. This is not a tenable situation for the Iranian people. But why is the opposition so weak? If you look at Iraq before the 2003 war, you had lots of factions in Washington, in London. They were crooks, but they had a coherent vision for the country. They had domestic patronage networks. They would be able to build a broadish coalition. We don't really see that with Iran. You've got the MEK and you've got Reza Pahlavi, but you've got nobody else. Or why is that?
I mean, in the 1980s, there were a lot more 1970s and 80s, I should say, there were a lot more left-wing organizations in Iran which had membership. They had strong institutions. A lot of these were armed groups like the Fedayeen. And militarily, these groups were defeated in the early 1980s. And once they went into Europe, they still exist in some regard. There's the Communist Party of Iran, there's the Worker Communist Party of Iran, but these are extraordinarily small organizations with very aged memberships, people who are in it since the early 1970s and have continued to do so since then. What has really hampered this is because Reza Pahlavi, as the son of the last Shah, has been such a public figure, that means that a lot of this discourse has to happen around him. And because Reza Pahlavi is so obsessed with Reza Pahlavi, that means that any opposition really gets strangled. The air gets taken out of it. There was an attempt after the Massa Amini protests to try to unify disparate factions of the opposition abroad. And the membership of this coalition itself was an example of how far the opposition has fallen, in that it was made up of not only Reza Pahlavi and Masih Ali-Nejad, who was a presenter at Radio Liberty, which is a U.S. government-operated organization, but also actors from the TV series Homeland, Kurdish separatist leaders, and things of this nature. And the coalition immediately collapsed. There was no coherent platform. Members of the organization admonished other people for demanding a coherent platform before the government was overthrown. And people openly said that Reza Pahlavi refusing to work with anybody else caused the dissolution of the organization. And now there are monarchist parties like Iranian Novin, which is a rebirthed version of the Royalist Party that existed in the past, but that is functionally inactive. It is just the Reza Pahlavi show.
I mean, I say it sort of flippantly online, and I think people think I'm being unnecessarily harsh, but I think it is the world's worst opposition movement. I've never, and some of the things they say, and I'm not talking about the people inside the country, I'm talking about primarily the diaspora. Well, I am talking about the diaspora. I'm talking about people outside of Iran. The things they say, like Maya Tusi saying bomb, 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 bomb Iran, taking a lead from a famous catchphrase many decades ago. People saying you need to bomb the country, you need to invade the country. There has never been a successful national liberation movement that has looked like this. You didn't have Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam when they were the French saying, please, America, bomb our country. You didn't see Sun Yat-sen or Mao or Deng Xiaoping saying, we want a war of national liberation against the Japanese, bomb our country. They did it themselves. And there is an argument, Séamus, and I find this a really interesting one, that the reason why the overseas opposition movement with regards to Iran is the world's worst, and I think it is actually, it's terrifyingly bad. I mean, you saw all the fights breaking out across various continents over the last few days. It's ridiculous, frankly. It looked ridiculous. It's because actually, particularly liberal secular Iranians do really well in the West. They assimilate very well. They professionally do very well. They make good money often. And so there are actually very few incentives for them to be serious about the politics of Iran, about building a broader coalition, because the reality is many of them don't even want to go back to Iran full time. They like the West. They're doing really well here. What's your take on that?
I think that's entirely correct. And this is something that Reza Pahlavi said himself about his own being. He was doing an interview with Patrick Bet-David, who is a conservative commentator who is from an Iranian family. And he said very plainly, talking about, okay, maybe I'll lead a transition or this and that. But on a human level, he was not considering going back to Iran because his family was here, all his friends are in America, his children were raised in America. He is functionally an American, and he has nothing to go back to in Iran. So he has no investment really in its future. He didn't say that. That's my own prediction. A lot of these people are not the Maoists that were rising up in Amul in 1981. These are people who were not fighting in Kurdistan during that same period. These are individuals, the main people who are in a near Reza Pahlavi's circle are people who fled in the 1970s and ended up in California or in the DC metro area or in Paris or in Berlin. And they have done quite well for themselves. And what has, I think, differentiated the Iranian diaspora from something like the Lebanese diaspora is a lot of people in the Iranian diaspora don't have financial connections. They don't have a lot of personal connections to the country as someone like someone who is in the Lebanese diaspora oftentimes sends remittances home. They go back to the country very often. Whereas if you're in the Iranian diaspora, because of the restrictions that you and I have just mentioned, they can't go back. Same thing with many people in the Cuban diaspora, which I think creates this cycle of deep hatred and want for military intervention in order to bring that kind of connection about. Reza Pahlavi was somebody who previously was very against military intervention. He was publicly, he said that. But once that was placed on the table by Israel and then by the United States, he revealed that, of course, he was always in favor of it. So you really can't take figures who condemn it at their word if they are so entrenched in these Western networks.
I think we'll leave it there. Really good to chat to you. I'm sure we'll get you back on again soon.
Take care.
Cheers. So interesting. I mean, we'll talk about this more in a moment because we're going to play some clips of Reza Pahlavi in a moment. So stick a pin in that because I think it's true. You can't say, I want to be the Shah of Iran. I want to lead a country, but you know what? I quite fancy being a dual national. Maybe I'll keep a place in Florida. I'll have a holiday home in Tehran. It doesn't work like that. As the international mood shifts and as Iran remains under tight communications blackout, the government has been keen to telegraph an image of strength to the world. Tens of thousands of people gathered in Tehran to take part in the Iranian uprising against American Zionist terrorism, bit of a mouthful, rally, with participants wearing national flags and chanting, "Death to Israel, death to USA." Some of those participants spoke to Iran's West Asian news agency.
I believe it was generally a plot by the United States and Israel, but people do have issues that need to be heard. Excessive inflation, price fluctuations. My husband has an online shop which is now shut, and all these are troubling. All that said, I am here, participating to defend my country.
I do not see the probability of Israel attacking, because the last time they took quite a beating and have not been able to put itself back together since. Actually, we are waiting for them to show them what taking a beating really means.
The first step is to speak with determination about possible foreign interventions. And the next step is to respond to the rightful objections that we, the people, have regarding the state of the economy. Talk to the people and answer them with honesty.
Today, the Iranian intelligence agency doubled down on the message that violence amongst the protesters is a result of external agitators. It said that US arms and explosive equipment had been seized from militants who hid the weapons in several homes. Meanwhile, Iranian state television reported that authorities had detained what were described as terrorist groups linked to Israel in the southeastern city of Zahedan. And the security crackdown against protests continues, with the Iranian state set to make a deadly example of one tomorrow. According to human rights organisation HENGAW, the family of 26-year-old Irfan Soltani have been informed that he will be executed tomorrow, the first of those arrested in connection with the protests to be killed by the state. Arrested on January 8th, Soltani was charged with the capital crime of waging war against God. It will have been 6 days between his arrest and his execution if it does indeed go ahead tomorrow, meaning the trial was incredibly fast. According to the HENGAW organisation for human rights, Soltani was deprived of fundamental legal rights, denied access to legal counsel, and given no opportunity to present a defence. Outside of Iran, pretenders to the throne are lining up. One of them is a pretender to the literal throne, once he's reinstated it, that is. Reza Pahlavi, former crown prince of Iran and the son of the last Shah, deposed by the 1979 Islamic Revolution, has been encouraging foreign military powers to intervene in the country. Last night, he appeared on CBS, where he gave an astonishing interview.
And as you are urging people to protest and go to the streets, the death toll is rising in Iran. This violent crackdown continues just as it has in past attempted revolutions. I mean, is it responsible to be sending citizens in Iran to their deaths? Do you bear some responsibility?
As I said, this is a war, and war has casualties.
This is a war, war has casualties. Very easy thing to say that, Kieran, from a nice warm room in Maryland or Florida. I think he's in Maryland right now. It's a war. It's easy to be the general of a war when you're a long way from the front line. What are your thoughts on that? You know, I compare Reza Pahlavi to, I think it's Ahmed Massoud, whose father, the Lion of Panjshir, was an anti-Taliban guy, military leader. He was killed by the Taliban. His son studied at King's College London, went to Sandhurst. Once his father died and, you know, he'd done his bit, he then returned to Afghanistan to literally fight with the Taliban. And maybe I sound a bit old school here, but if you're telling people to fight and die against a regime and you're trying to lead that fight, you should probably be somewhere near the country. You certainly shouldn't be in Maryland. Am I being unfair? Is this being obtuse?
Not at all. And I'd just say I feel very sorry for the brave people who are protesting in Iran, that this is somebody who has appointed themselves their figurehead. I think, Aaron, I'd like to go back briefly to 1979 to make this point, or to start this point. It's really important to understand that 1979 wasn't a coup. It was a genuinely popular uprising. It was a genuinely widespread popular revolution. And that's relevant to say now, not because it confers any degree of legitimacy on the regime in 2026. That would obviously be an absurd stretch. What it does do is it underscores how illegitimate his father, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had become. And for that to be basically his sole claim to power, that his father was this person who was deposed in a genuinely popular revolution in 1979, seems to me to be beyond absurd. Western sanctions. We're always talking about Western sanctions in the context of the 80s and 90s. Western sanctions go all the way back to the early 1940s. The reason I want to mention this is because we had somebody say Iran can never be a failed state, and you rightly dismissed that or rebuked that, Aaron. But any cursory reading of Iranian history will show why that is such a, forgive me, but absurd statement. Early 1940s, the British imposed crippling sanctions. First of all, the Brits and the Russians rolled into Iran virtually unopposed at the beginning of World War II to secure oil. In the late 1940s, when it appeared that that oil was once again threatened, the British imposed crippling sanctions on Iran. It's important to understand that the history of sanctions in Iran goes way back before the 1980s and 90s. And that basically led to this guy's father, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi Shah, removing Mohammad Mossadegh from power in 1953, the prime minister who was keen to nationalize Iran's oil reserves, and basically allowing himself to be propped up ad infinitum by Western powers. He was called the suitcase monarch by Iranians because he always had a suitcase packed because he was always ready to leave. And so his son operating out of Maryland, it's the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It's continuity with his father's tradition in that respect. The CIA had to basically set up a secret police force to keep him propped up throughout his entire regime, his father, that is. And the year his father died, which was a year after the Iranian Revolution, so 1980, he proclaimed himself the rightful Shah of Iran. Obviously, the regime had been deposed. He was 19 years old. He was 19 years old in 1980, and he said that he is now Shah of Iran when his father passed away. He went to a private school that was named after himself. As much as I dislike Etonians or what they stand for, at least none of them went to schools literally named after themselves. He spent most of his life in America and Switzerland and elsewhere. And all of this, I think, leads to the most important point, because some of these points I'm making might be seen as gossip or frivolous. Anybody who thinks that this guy isn't going to rule with an iron fist if he got into power, say this guy somehow does get hold of the levers of the machinery of the state, he's going to have to rule in a very authoritarian way. Because first of all, it's not clear what his power base is. It's not clear he's got a critical mass of support in the country. And in order to consolidate power, it's going to be necessary for him to be authoritarian. So, yeah.
This idea, but before we move on, this idea that Iran will just seamlessly go to a multi-party democracy. And of course, that's not what happens in these places. But Iran has literally no history of that. It's got 3,000 years. The principle of monarchy, and this is an argument that monarchists would probably make, the principle of absolute power and monarchy stretches back thousands of years in Iran. It has absolutely no, has moments. Mossadegh, the constitutional revolution of the early 20th century, but it has no real history of multi-party democracy or civil liberties. And these people in America and Britain and Germany are saying, well, no, we can be just like Britain. We can be just like France. We can be just like Germany. We can be just like the United States. Seamlessly from, anno zero, day one, we'll walk in, we'll be fine. I thought we'd learned this lesson. I really thought we'd learned this lesson. This is utterly insane. But seemingly we haven't. Seemingly we haven't. It just goes on and on and on and on. And all the lessons I thought we would have learned from the last 20 years just haven't been learned. And one more thing, you seem to you want to say something. You said something at the start of that, which is 1979 was a popular revolution. It was. There's a reason why the Shah fell, which had the backing, by the way, that regime of the US and the UK. There's a reason why it fell. It was a popular uprising. It included the left. It included the middle classes. It included intellectuals, of course, religious elites. It included the Bazaris of Tehran. It included all of the major focus points of power in the country beyond, the military, basically. That's why it won. And of course, people now trying to get rid of the Islamic Republic, which they're entitled to think that and want to do that, particularly after potentially thousands of people die, are having to rewrite history. And this is what really aggravates me as somebody who's on the left. It was Michel Foucault and the left and some religious maniacs, and that's who supported the revolution. You think that would have won? Of course it wouldn't have won. It was a popular revolution. And the fact that Iranians, particularly Iranian monarchists, can't be honest about things that happened almost half a century ago suggests to me they're not going to have an effective theory of change in 2026 and over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years. Because you can't be honest about why you lost the last time. And this, to me, really goes back to a quintessential Iranian feature, which is always blaming others. Always blaming others, always blaming external factors. There's a great comedy in Iranian media, My Uncle Napoleon, where the protagonist of the comedy blames the British for everything. His bathwater is cold. He falls sick. His dinner isn't what he wants. He blames these kind of mercurial, hidden British forces, which really gets something quite deep within the Iranian psyche, which, by the way, there's some truth to it, right? This was a country that was repeatedly fragmented, invaded, where the will of the people was being subverted by external forces, American, Russian, and British. But it's not a healthy political culture if you want to establish democracy. And what we saw over the last couple of days is in, I believe it was Los Angeles, right? One guy, they say he was MEK, which is a crazy political organization, driving through protesters after they'd smashed his window. You see in, I think it was in Canada, in maybe it was Toronto or Vancouver, people having a punch-up because one guy's saying, I'm anti-regime, but I'm also anti-Shah. And you see similar things in London. Iranians, the way they talk about themselves online, again, the Iranian diaspora, you'd think they're Vulcans, right? We are Zoroastrians, we're a 3,000-year-old culture. They have this sense of innate superiority. I'm not seeing it. If somebody, one guy was pepper sprayed at a protest because he's saying I'm anti-Shah. You want to have a democracy, but you're going to pepper spray somebody who has a minor disagreement with you. That's not how it works in the West, mate. Before we go on,
this is why I say worst case scenario, Pandora's box. Best case scenario, in the short term, authoritarian regime under someone else like a returned Shah. In the longer term, it's possible that genuinely popular movements weaken the Islamic State and things change, but that's in the longer term. All I was going to say, Aaron, as a final point was that in the build-up to the war in Iraq, I'm old enough to remember the build-up to the war in Iraq, and I remember that the Kurdish Iraqis or Kurds were some of the most vocal proponents of the war in Iraq. And you can completely understand why. There was no group that was more persecuted under Saddam more violently and more viciously than the Kurds. didn't change anything about the outcome of the war in Iraq, though. However legitimate their desire for regime change was, it changed nothing about the utter cataclysm that followed. And so I do think we need to think much more circumspectly about things like failed states when there is regime change or failed regime change.
Let's go back to the rest of the story. It's strange to call protests, even an uprising, a war, one that necessarily will have casualties. And by dismissing the killing of civilian protesters by the regime as simply casualties of war, as Reza Pahlavi did, he of course legitimizes that use of force. If the protesters are at war, then of course, so is the state. And it's therefore legitimate for one, the state, to kill the other. It gives you something of an insight into how he, the son of an autocratic, despotic leader, conceptualizes the relationship between the state and its people. And also, therefore, how he might understand his relationship to them were he to run it. Let's go back quickly to that interview with Pahlavi on CBS.
In fact, in order to preserve and protect and minimize the death toll, minimize innocent victims yet again be killed by this regime, action is needed. The regime is going to try and brutalize its citizenry as it has always done. But we are in a fight for liberation. I didn't ask the people to come to the streets to fight against the regime because I wanted so. They asked me to step in to help them and to be their voice on the outside world, to do everything that we can so we make this uprising successful this time. And I think we have some serious leaders that understand what is necessary, that understand the ask of the Iranian people and are responding to that. I think President Trump is responding to the call that the Iranian people have. The Iranian people have heard his words. They are naming streets after him in Iran. There's a difference. They know he's no Barack Obama or Joe Biden. And that's why they do have a higher expectation. And we'll see what happens. And as you say, I think the president has a decision to make fairly soon. We're doing what we need to do regardless of whether help will come or not. I'm just stating that the best way to ensure that there will be less people killed in Iran is to intervene sooner so this regime finally collapses and puts an end to all the problems that we are facing.
Regime collapse, he's saying it himself. Before I come to you, I think this is really important to say. Of course, any foreign conflict means that people here in the US get to attack their domestic opponents. That seems to be the main point of interest. Thousands of people died, but you know what? It means I get to attack people who care about 16,000 kids being killed in Gaza. The idea that Obama did nothing with Iran is absolutely insane. The United States imposes the world's first ever sanctions on a central bank in 2012. Guess who the president was? Guess who the president was? So this idea that there hasn't been a consensus, a continuity, and by the way, Congress started those sanctions. Congress started these incredibly effective sanctions after 2006. But the idea there isn't continuity since 2006 all the way through to today is ridiculous. But again, these lies and these distortions have a political purpose, right? It allows Trump domestically. It also allows, Iranian pro-monarchy people to say, you know what, Trump, you're the guy. The last guy was terrible. They want to big him up because they know he's an egomaniac. But in none of this is there the truth. And in media coverage of all of this, I haven't heard that said a single time. These very onerous sanctions, these very effective sanctions start with Obama. Kieran.
Not only do they start with Obama, you're absolutely right to bring Obama into this. Yeah, big critic of Obama in lots of ways, but the P5+1 deal, as it was called, the Iran nuclear deal, was imperfect, but it was, I think, a very, very effective piece of diplomacy, of international treaty making, of statecraft, actually. It was a very complex deal that actually reconciled lots of very disparate interests. And I urge people to, maybe the media will become the message in the sense that because it's Obama's deal and, on the left, Obama rightly is highly criticized, people won't see it objectively. But I think it was actually the best thing his administration ever did, the single good thing, maybe, that his administration ever did. And it was for that to be thrown away in 2018 by Trump was, I think, an act of geostrategic vandalism. And it was certainly done for domestic political consumption. It was certainly done to toss red meat at his base rather than anything else or the merits of the deal itself. So yeah, it goes beyond the fact that he sanctioned it. It also extends to the fact that there was a perfectly good deal in place in a world of very imperfect deals and very imperfect international relations.
We've got one more story tonight, believe it or not. I saw one of the chat, one person in the chat saying, are there other stories? We have one other story. Before we go to that, we've got a super chat from Tahrane Ahmadi Parker, long-time friend of the show. Reza Pahlavi is a fake friend of Netanyahu and supporting the genocide in Gaza. Not many people want him in Iran. He is the enemy. The people that do want him in Iran, and that is a real constituency in the country, they want him because there's nobody else. You know, they're not happy with the status quo in the country for a range of reasons. Some ideological, most of them less so, actually. The economy is just being dismantled. There is nobody else. And as we were talking about earlier, it's quite extraordinary. After 47 years, this huge diaspora, including many intelligent people, hasn't created somebody else. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's worth asking why. 2 hunger-striking remand prisoners linked to Palestine Action have now entered a critical state after having refused food for well over 2 months. 31-year-old Hiba Moraisi has not eaten for 72 days. That's a little over 10 weeks. Moraisi is now reportedly suffering from muscle spasms, breathlessness, severe pain, and a low white blood cell count. Friends who have visited her say she has at times even lost the ability to speak. Her memory is also said to be in decline. She's been admitted to hospital 3 times over the past 9 weeks. Imprisoned in Newhall Prison in West Yorkshire, Moraisi was arrested in November 2024. She's charged with criminal damage over the role she is alleged to have played in a Palestine action against an August 2024 Elbit Systems site in Filton. Having now spent some 14 months in prison, Moraisi has yet to be convicted or even charged of a single crime and isn't set to face trial until summer at the earliest. That means that, if she survives, she'll have spent at least 18 months, possibly even 2 years, in prison without a trial. Also on hunger strike is 28-year-old Kamran Ahmed, who has not eaten for 65 days, just over 9 weeks. He's held at HMP Pentonville in central London. Ahmed was also arrested in November 2024 for his alleged role in the Elbit action, where £1 million worth of damage to the weapons company's property is alleged to have been carried out. He too has been on remand in prison for almost 14 months and won't face trial until much later this year. Again, that's at the earliest. Ahmed was taken to hospital for the 7th time last week, where doctors said his heart has shrunk, its muscles are shrinking, they're atrophying, with his heart rate slowing to 40 beats per minute. An emergency doctor who is advising the hunger strikers says he believes Moraisi and Ahmed have reached a critical phase in which death and irreversible health damage are increasingly likely. Hiba Moraisi has recently replied to questions from Al Jazeera via a friend. This is just some of what she said. Physically, I am deteriorating as the days go by. I no longer feel hunger. I feel pain. I don't think about my life. I think about how or when I could die. But despite this, mentally, I've never been stronger, more determined, and sure, most importantly, I feel calm and a great sense of ease. Even though the risks may be lifelong consequences or a devastating end, I think it's important to fight for justice and for freedom. I'm choosing to continue this because for the first time in 15 months, I'm finally being heard. On her conditions in prison, Moraisi said this: "Since concentrating has become gradually more difficult, I can no longer read like how I used to, so I now listen to the radio a lot. I love music and it's a shame I can't get the CDs I want, but nonetheless, I'm grateful to have some songs playing." Moraisi has also accused the prison of blocking her access to news from the outside world, in particular, news of Palestine, where she has family. She told Al Jazeera this: "Anything Palestine-related, including the book We Are Not Numbers, an anthology of emerging writers from Gaza, has been deemed inappropriate. I rely on those I call for news." The hunger strike, which currently involves 2 other prisoners, is the largest coordinated hunger strike in British prisons since the famous 1981 May's hunger strikes of Irish Republican prisoners in Northern Ireland. That, of course, was led by Bobby Sands. Of the 10 who died during that strike, 8 passed away before reaching the 70-day mark. 2, Kevin Lynch and Kieran Doherty, lived for 71 and 73 days, respectively. A reminder, Hiba Maraisi will soon have been on hunger strike for 73 days. The hunger strikers are demanding bail, the right to a fair trial, and the deprescription of Palestine Action. In July last year, the group was designated a terrorist organisation, putting it in the same category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The group's co-founder, Huda Amori, has been fighting that prescription in court, with a ruling on her judicial review of the then Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's decision to prescribe the group imminent. Over 2,700 people have also been arrested following protests over the prescription, simply for holding up signs saying, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." Since the prescription of the group, publicly expressing support for Palestine Action is a crime under the Terrorism Act. The prisoners are also demanding an end to what they call censorship in prison, accusing authorities of withholding mail, calls and books since the prescription of Palestine Action, which came months after their arrests. Nor have any of the hunger strikers been charged under terror law. Finally, the hunger strikers are calling for all Elbit sites to be closed in the UK. One already has. The Bristol site of the Israeli arms manufacturer that was targeted by Palestine Action was shuttered late last year, several years before its lease was due to end. And what of Elbit? While British citizens are remanded in prison for what seems like eternity, branded as terrorists for holding signs, and literally dying of hunger to secure the basic rights of prisoners who've not yet been found guilty of a single crime, Elbit has been having a bumper genocide. Its profits have risen sharply from late 2023 onwards, as it, presumably, fed the insatiable demands of the Israeli military. In 2025, the company's gross profits were over $1.8 billion. That was up 10% on its more than $1.6 billion profit the year before. And in November last year, it signed an international contract worth $2.3 billion, though it doesn't say with which country. More kids sniped from drones coming to a war zone near you. Kieran, the context of what's going on here with the Palestine Action hunger strikers and that comparison to what we saw in the early 1980s with Irish Republican hunger strikers is really critical, because in the early 1980s, those hunger strikes were viewed as a national story, but also a global story. We covered Iran earlier on today in the show. There is a road, there's a street named after Bobby Sands, one of those hunger strikers, in Tehran. But it only seems that this has really percolated up the news agenda, domestically at least, in the last couple of weeks. Why is that?
Well, I'll come to that in a moment. I don't want to sound too mawkish. This is an analysis show, after all. But I think, Aaron, that the people in Gaza have for a very long time been the conscience of the world. And I think that these hunger strikers and all people associated with actions related to Palestine Action who are in prison have been the conscience of this country. You really have to be armor-plated to deal with the hypocrisy, the level of hypocrisy here. On the one hand, you have the historical role that Britain played in the destruction of Palestine. And then you have the role that's played pivotally in the present, so the profiteering economically, pointed it out with the image on screen there, the profiteering economically, the diplomatic cover that's given to the Israeli government, the unwillingness to abide by international law or cooperate with investigations under the rubric of international law, the condemnation of human rights abuses only when our enemies do it. The lesson is very clear. If you hide behind the aegis of the state and you ally yourself with the West, you can murder children and still be received in central London for cocktails and canapes. If you take peaceful, direct action to prevent more children being murdered, the British state will arrest you, throw you in prison, prevent you from reading the books you want to read, and keep you there without bail or trial for many, many, many months and indeed years. I do believe that whatever happens, Aaron, to Palestine in the future, these people will one day be regarded in the same way that we now regard the suffragettes, and that Lammy Starmer, Yvette Cooper will either be forgotten entirely or will be deplored as the Edwardian reactionaries that opposed the suffragettes are now deplored. And to your point about Bobby Sands and streets being named after people, if Palestine is ever free, it's an if, we'll work towards it, there will be streets named after these people and there will be statues built in their honour. Why it's lower down the agenda, I think that the state has gone into absolute overdrive along with its outriders in the media to reflect the interests and the will of the Israel lobby and to strangulate and suffocate at every opportunity the appropriate level of coverage for something as seismic as is happening right under our noses right now. That's my view. I think it has everything to do with the power and the deeply embedded nature of the Israel lobby. And I think that it's being reflected in the way that institutions act, media, state, and otherwise.
This point about the Israel lobby, I think, is so key. You know, if you look at Britain and you look at the United States and how they relate to Palestine, Israel, Iran, it is so unique. Let me give you one example. Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, is arrested in 2018. She's arrested. Imagine the daughter of Bill Gates being arrested by the Chinese. She's arrested in Canada, and they're trying to get her extradited to the United States to face charges. Why? Because Huawei had some kind of shell company in Iran that was building telecommunications infrastructure in the country. That sounds quite strange, right? To go around arresting the daughter of the CEO, you can buy a Huawei phone in this country, right? Very, very strange. Now, why is that happening? Iran isn't that important, right? Well, it kind of is. If you have a very powerful domestic lobby, which seeks regional hegemony in West Asia, but also views this other country, whatever you think of Iran, as a major obstacle with regards to what they want to do regionally, but also in the West Bank and in Gaza. Whatever your views, and of course in Lebanon as well. Whatever your views on that. Then you look at Britain. We've criminalised people holding signs. Now, if you hold a sign saying, I support Palestine, comma, action is needed, that's legal. Move the comma one word and you could be banged up for a few months. Minimum, by the way. You wear a t-shirt with Palestine Action, you're facing 6 months. This isn't normal, right? So why is it happening? And I think the only explanation why we're arresting, or why is the United States arresting daughters of CEOs? Why are we potentially banging up people for 6 months for wearing the wrong t-shirt? I think it can all be located in the same place, which is the Israel lobby. Now, people might say that's anti-Semitic, it's a dog whistle. No, it's a very sophisticated, coordinated accumulation of power by a very sophisticated, highly intelligent political apparatus in a foreign state trying to maximize its own perceived interests. The most predictable thing in the world, right? By the way, many states do that. The most predictable thing in the world, but it shouldn't be undermining the civil liberties of people in this country. Of course, these people should be on bail. The idea that you could be held for 2 years without being charged on remand is outrageous. And I've seen people, the same people who would support Lucy Connolly, who got 30 odd months, right, for a tweet. I don't think if she should have gone inside, it should have been for a very short, sharp shock. The same people saying how outrageous that are saying it's fine for people to be on remand for 2.5 years. Well, we know they did it. That's not how it works. That's not how the rule of law works. We'll be fair and have the rule of law, but just the people we like. No, it has to also apply to the people you don't like, otherwise it can't work. The point is it's equality under the law for everyone. That's why it's the law. Kieran, any final thoughts on this story? And I agree with you, by the way. These are people who will... I'm not a hyperbolic person on this stuff, right? I'm actually quite a skeptical person. I think these people are genuinely going to go down as individuals fighting for civil liberties in this country. I do believe that. I think eventually somebody is going to repeal the Terrorism Act because it's a ridiculous piece of legislation. It shouldn't be used like this. And I think if these people pass away or endure long-term health consequences, I think people rightly will recognise their role in getting rid of an appalling piece of legislation.
My final reflection, Aaron, is that everything you say about the Israel lobby, I agree with. I think that the Israel lobby has become much more important for the survival of the state of Israel in the past 20 years. And so that is almost said by me as a form of encouragement to people, as strange as that might seem. They are getting increasingly desperate because they used to be able to rely on their international reputation and a romantic myth that was built up around them very diligently when the nation state was itself built. That's evaporated for various reasons we won't go into now. So they're having to lean much more heavily on the apparatus of the Israel lobby, and they're having to beef that up exponentially and pack it with as much wherewithal as possible as a means of survival. So although it seems like actually, muscle, there's nowhere breaking through this, they've got a grip on all sorts of powerful institutions in the West, and unfortunately, the sorts of things we're discussing now, the consequences of that in the short term, I actually think we ought to see it in the longer term as a sign of weakness, because Israel can't rely on its traditional romantic Hasbara anymore. That's gone forever.
100%. That's
genuinely gone forever. So the blowfish, puffed out, but actually pop it very easily.
I do think the biggest threat to civil liberties and freedom of speech in the West is actually the Israel lobby. Sorry, I do. Kieran, we had a great show.
We did.
I'm not very well. I'm rather sick. Maybe you noticed. As are you, but you were so lucid. I can't believe it.
Oh, well, I was going to say exactly the same back to you.
Thank you very much.
Two sick men.
Two sick men. If you want to support our work here at Novara Media, of course you can. As I said at the top of the show, go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. On these two stories tonight, Iran and Palestine Action, legacy media is slop. You could watch BBC News 24 all day, listen to BBC Radio 4, read the papers. You will learn nothing of any value in regards to Iran. Whatever your views on it, by the way, you will learn nothing. I learned more talking to Séamus in 5 minutes than I would have learned from watching BBC News for several days. So if you value that, support our work. At the very least, subscribe to this channel. Kieran, thanks for joining me tonight.
As ever, brilliant to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in. Hopefully I'll be better next week. Come back tomorrow for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.